Alright, and we're back. So I did want to finish up this slide. So the reason Powhatan had allowed the English to stay, which I started alluding to, was that he was really enjoying European trade, and he enjoyed having allies against other native groups as well. Um, so after Powhatan dies, his brothers will not allow the English to remain quite as peacefully. We'll get to that in a minute. I do first want to talk about the start of the tobacco craze. So that officially was started in 1617 because of John Rolfe. He started really growing this as a cash crop. And that was the same year, in fact, that Powhatan did die. So when he died, like I said, his brothers took over. They weren't as fond of the English, and they did end up attacking in 1622. And in these attacks, about 1/4 of colonial Virginia died. And so after that, there was a complete English retaliation. So like in one decade, almost an entire generation of native men died. They pushed the Powhatan Confederacy west and gained hundreds of acres more land in Virginia. So super big retaliation for those attacks in 1622. The news of those deaths and the wars caused James I eventually to take the Virginia colony away from Virginia Company. But before that happens, the Virginia Company tried to pass this reform, or they did pass it. So this was a scheme to sort of make more money off of the colony. And so their plan was to give all settlers 100 acres of land in Virginia, settlers that were already there, to give new settlers 50 acres of land, and for anybody that would pay the way for somebody who couldn't afford it, that person paying would get 50 acres per person that they paid passage for. And this is where indentured servitude starts in Virginia, because anyone who couldn't pay their way, they'd have someone pay their way for them, and then they would owe them 4 to 7 years of labor. So that starts right around this time. The last part of this plan is giving Virginia a representative assembly, so giving them a governor and a council. So the result of this plan was that there was a huge English migration to Virginia. They heavily started farming tobacco, this cash crop that John Rolfe started, and again, indentured servitude, especially working on those tobacco farms. Okay, so like I said, we're not ready for that one yet. James does take Virginia away from the Virginia Company and makes it a royal colony. And when this happens, he tells people to start growing less tobacco. James I hated tobacco. He called it the stinking weed. And he told them to plant more corn and more cattle so that the colony would be able to be more healthy and actually thrive. So when he did that, the health did improve. It increased survival in Virginia. And by 1650, there were about 15,000 English people in Virginia. Okay, so now we're ready to move on. We're going to start talking about some of the other colonies that come into play here. So we have Maryland. Maryland was founded a little later on, 1632, by one family. It was an aristocratic family called the Calverts, and they were a Catholic family. So for people who wanted to move to Maryland, they granted religious freedom. And this family owned, in quotation marks, about 10 million acres of land. It took 10 million acres of land, basically, and then rented that out to anyone who wanted that religious freedom. They had a governor, council, local courts, and Virginia was pretty annoyed with Maryland, for one, because there was religious freedom for, well, not religious freedom for everyone, religious freedom for Christians. So they didn't like having all of these Catholic people nearby because, they were pretty heavily Protestant. And another thing that annoyed them was that Maryland started getting into the tobacco business as well and cutting into the profits of Virginia. Okay, moving right along here. We do have a crisis in England shortly after this. And this crisis is the Civil War, which takes place from 1642 to 51. And what happens here is Charles I sort of steps out of what people think the king should be doing. He dismisses Parliament, rules without the consent of Parliament for quite a while. And there's a war. So the war is between the Roundheads, who are for Parliament, and they want to get rid of the king, and the Cavaliers, which are the people who are on the side of the king. And so you can see them here in this propaganda piece. We have Cromwell here, who's in charge of the Roundheads. He's their leader, and they're all fairly Puritan people, very religious. And you can see they have their manly dog here, and he's calling out the Cavaliers here. This man here, who has his not-so-manly dog, this is Prince Rupert, and often his dog was made fun of in printings like this, although in this one the dog isn't quite as silly, but they liked to make fun of the fact that Prince Rupert had a poodle. And so you can see he's saying, "Bite him, Pepper," to his dog, and then he's saying, "To him, Poodle." So it's just one of those cartoons that's showing a little bit of a standoff. Prince Rupert is definitely one of my history crushes. He was the nephew of Charles I, so very much a Cavalier and a great navigator, and I'll not get into it, but you should research Prince Rupert. He's fascinating. Okay, so we have this war. They end up killing Charles I and ruling without a king for 6 years. So Cromwell here is in charge of England for quite a while. That doesn't go well either, and so they reinstate the monarchy in 1660 with Charles II, who is the son of Charles I. And they tell him that you have to govern with the approval of Parliament. And for sure he does, because he saw what happened to his dad, so he is more in line here. Charles also passes these navigation acts while he's king, so in 1660 and then again in 1663, which is a restriction of trade, so making it so that cash crops from the colonies go directly to England, making sure that any non-cash crops are at least transported on English vessels, so really tightening down and creating policies in favor of mercantilism, again enriching trade in England's favor. And so because of these new navigation acts, and also because the price of tobacco drops, it does cause some colonial unrest and economic depression in the colonies. So people are not pleased with the navigation acts. All right, we also have a change in society taking place where labor moves from indentured servitude, like I mentioned, and it moves more towards slavery. And part of this is because of the adoption of growing sugar, and part of this is economics. So the reason I say economics, when people were first coming to the colonies, life expectancy was short. And so if you were going to spend some amount of money for an indentured servant who, like, 60% of the time lived to see the end of their service, that's one thing. But if you're going to pay even more money than that to purchase a human being for life, when they're probably going to die in 4 to 7 years anyway, most people were paying for an indentured servant because life expectancy, it just didn't make sense. But when life expectancy rose, people started purchasing human beings for their entire life. And coupled with sugar, it really starts taking off. So by 1740, about 40% of people who are in Virginia colonists, were black and enslaved. 40%, when, 100 years earlier, it had been virtually zero. So this is where we start seeing systematic racism, which, includes the creation of laws to make it so that people are separated. So, of course, much stricter policies in place for anyone of color. A lot of times this is like, oh, a white person can hit any black person whenever they want, no punishment ever. Whereas if a black person even touched a white person, the white person could do whatever they want as a punishment to them. So there's very much telling society this group is better than the other group. Let's see. The cultivation of white supremacy as well, and that's partly due to these laws, right? Making it easier for poor white settlers to make an independent living, giving voting rights only to white landowners, slowly opening that up to just white people. And all of this plays in together. Systematic racism, telling society that white people are better during this time. This is really when that starts. Colonies start having a change as well. So average families had like a small amount of land. They had maybe a couple enslaved people working for them, but sometimes not. And always on a smaller home, you would see the family members actually doing work themselves. So even if they had enslaved people working for them, they were out there with those people, working next to them, treating them a little more like human beings than these rich families who had huge tracts of land, hundreds of enslaved people working on them, and basically treated their enslaved workers like they were dirt. So there is a difference in treatment in that way. Okay, next. We have some drama in the Caribbean. So the English start getting into the Caribbean. Really, the first intention is to just steal from Spain, pick on their ships, pick on their colonies a little bit. And so this is the period when you start thinking about like pirates and buccaneers. Buccaneers are pirates of the Caribbean. You have the English privateers, English pirates, going down to the Caribbean, picking on Spain, who is starting to get weakened at this point. And England's not the only one doing it, so you've got the Dutch and the French out there as well. They all start picking on Spain, and these different nations start getting islands in the Caribbean as well. Now, the English people who were going to the Caribbean, and this is mostly between the 1600s to the 1640s, were these young men who didn't want to do any work. They were working at these low-quality tobacco farms. They drank all the time. It was really sort of just a Lord of the Flies type situation there. But eventually, they started growing sugar, and they started bringing in a ton of enslaved people to work on the sugar. Sorry. So with this population explosion, people started thinking they might want to move out of the Caribbean. It was getting really crowded. But that sugar that they were growing with that huge population boom made a ton of money for England. So it was very popular for quite a while. These men, too many people there, so they're complaining about population. There's a lot of disease in the Caribbean. There's a land shortage because there are so many people. Fear of rebellion because there are so many enslaved people. The enslaved population in the Caribbean typically outnumbered English by 4 to 1. And in the first 100 years of English presence, there were like 7 major slave uprisings. And that's not counting just the average slave uprisings. These are the major ones. Some of them were successful. And one fun thing about this is when pirates would come into port, pirates would come into town, the enslaved population knew about it. They knew that chaos was about to ensue, and oftentimes that itself would spark a rebellion. And as you'll read next week or the week after, when we start talking about black pirates a little bit, some of those black pirates came from this situation where they were enslaved, pirates came into town, and then, they became pirates. It's pretty awesome. Let's see. I have time for one more slide here. Let's talk about the Carolinas. So the Carolinas were founded by 2 supporters of Charles I, who was that king who was beheaded. So 2 of his supporters had been exiled to the Caribbean. They saw this need for Englishmen to have more land, and so they got permission from Charles II to colonize the Carolinas in 1663. They were given a governor and representatives, and the 2 Carolinas did break off in 1701. North Carolina was kind of seen as a poorer colony. They didn't have much river or ocean access. There was a low population, so that one wasn't really thriving. But South Carolina really started thriving. The gentlemen there thought they would turn this into like a rich man's utopia where there would be nobility like in England. But instead of this sort of ideal haven for rich white men, we did end up having a series of wars. And I have to pause, and I'll tell you about those wars on the next part. So take a break. I'll see you in a few.